Okay, let's make a start then. Good afternoon, or in fact, good morning to our wonderful listeners, depending on where you've joined us from today. Our wonderful listeners, friends and colleagues, thank you for your time in tuning in today as we discuss revised parameter values. My name is Angela Juhas and I will be your moderator today. Now, in terms of housekeeping, we are recording today's session, and a copy of the recording together with the presentation material will be shared with our wonderful listeners once the session has concluded. Our regular listeners would know that webinars work best when they are interactive, and so please don't be shy if you are tuning in for the first time. We welcome you to type through your questions and comments into the question box at any time. Now, I think I've done just about enough talking, but before I hand over to our presenter, I would like our audience to join me in giving a big virtual round of applause for our presenter today, Dr. Clifford Nordia of ARB Group. Since joining ARB 10 years ago, Cliff has undertaken numerous projects, mainly in the areas of economic evaluation and road pricing. His current projects include updated parameter values for use in economic evaluation of road transport projects, as well as development of an economic evaluation tool for small intersection projects. A warm welcome to you, Cliff. Thank you for your time in joining us today.
Thank you, Angela. Hello, everyone. My name is Cliff Nordia. I'm going to be running the webinar this afternoon. And with me are Tyrone Toole, the Chief Advisor of Asset Management at ARB, Torolf Torrison at ARB and one of our economists. And then we've also got together with us Ed McGeehan of VicRoads, who is the Austroads and National Guidelines project manager overseeing this piece of work.
We certainly look forward to hearing a little bit more about the project, Cliff. And I'm needed on that end, so
oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I beg your pardon. Sorry. Thanks, Angela. Now, I'd just like to acknowledge the following colleagues who contributed to the project. That's Ed McGeehan, as I say, of VicRoads, who was the Austroads and National Guidelines project manager. Teriro Makwasha, who helped out on the crash data. Tyrone Toole, who played the role of quality manager on the project and also helped with the vehicle operating cost models section of the work. Ron Roper, who did a lot of the analysis and estimation of the VOC models that you'll see today. Torolf Torrison, whose past work on VOC models and input on the project has been invaluable. And then finally, Melissa Diaz and Michael Byrne, who helped out with the surveys of the oil and tire companies and also new vehicle surveys that we've conducted in the work. Now, the focus of the presentation will be on key issues and findings of the project, which was undertaken as an Austroads project, but has been used as input for the National Guidelines review. Previously, this work has been undertaken as updates of Part 4 of the unit values of the Austroads Guide to Project Evaluation. And detailed data is in the report on the NGTSM website. That's ngtsmguidelines.com. And I'll give you a link at the end of the presentation. We've also adopted an inverted pyramid approach to the presentation. In other words, dealing with issues with the most impact on the project, which really stood out for us in terms of implications for practitioners. And these issues would include the re-estimation of the VOC or vehicle operating cost models as a major component of the project, and probably the biggest departure from previous updates of the Austroads Guide to Project Evaluation Part 4. There was also a component of vehicle classification which underpins the changes in values and physical consumption units on the project, and this has major impacts for the values used in cost-benefit analysis. Those are the two main items which are a departure from previous work. Then there were other methodologies and prices which were compiled, which were very important still, and those are crash costs, travel time values, and also updating the normal parameter values for road user effects components, such as the fuel price, oil, tire prices, new vehicles to take account of depreciation, and so on. terms of the update and its objective in working to consistency and cost-benefit analysis in Australia, various methods were used to estimate and update vehicle operating costs, and these were reviewed in the project, including their technical basis as reported through various Austroad studies over time. It is also important to recognize the need to provide models which possess a number of key attributes, which can be applied and updated in a clear and consistent manner to meet the following objectives. These would include to better accommodate changes in vehicle technologies and changing vehicle fleet, to be amenable for application across networks subject to uninterrupted and interrupted stop-start road traffic conditions, and then finally models which are capable of application to general cost-benefit analysis studies at a network level and for major capital projects. And by addressing such issues and the use of a sufficiently well-defined vehicle fleet or vehicle classification, and through regular updating of these unit values and models, this update should improve consistency in cost-benefit analysis and other related applications. The first and one of the most important issues that we have built into the project this time around is that of vehicle classification. Now, an attempt was made in the project to identify vehicle classifications appropriate to Australia. An overview is provided in the report of developments in vehicle classifications over time, as well as the 20 vehicle classification which was used for the application of parameter values in the project. Now, this was undertaken as it's broadly consistent with a vehicle classification in previous years that has been developed by various pieces of Austroad's work, and it also was aimed at providing a sufficiently broad range of vehicle types from which practitioners can select the vehicles most appropriate to their local vehicle fleet for their particular analysis. Now, these vehicle classifications used in Australia, including the Austroad's 12-bin classification, are also outlined in the report. The objective was therefore to strike a balance in the number of vehicle types included in the classification. So in other words, to provide more detail than previous updates, but at the same time to keep that level of detail manageable in terms of data. The VOC models estimated in this update used the 20 vehicle classification for both urban and rural models. The slide also shows the parameter of the models in terms of mass or payload where applicable, and then equivalent standard axles at various payloads. Passenger car or passenger car standard equivalents are also provided. The vehicle classification also includes the Austroad's classification as far as possible. This part of the project involved the updating of parameter values for road user effects components, namely fuel, oil, tires, and new vehicles. Travel time, in other words for vehicle occupants and freight, were also updated. And finally, average crash costs by injury severity across jurisdictions were also estimated using both the human capital and willingness to pay approaches. Retail or market prices for the various vehicle operating cost components were adjusted by taxes and subsidies where appropriate to produce resource prices for use in economic evaluation. The table shows data sources and methodologies used to update the prices, as well as identifying changes to the methodologies where this occurred. For example, in terms of fuel prices used pretty much the same methodology as previously. However, there were a number of items which need to be borne in mind both with regard to this update and in future updates. In other words, the demise of fuel subsidy schemes across various jurisdictions, and of course the introduction of fuel indexation and fuel tax credit post June 2013. Both oil and tire prices involved surveys of retail outlets and brand or manufacturers or importers, but there were some small changes in the methodologies, including the bulk purchases of oil, for example, in larger containers, and for tires, the calculation of a weighted average of driver and trailer tires for the different vehicle types that you've just seen. In terms of new vehicles, this involved the calculation of prices of different classes of light vehicles, as well as for heavies. And there was also a couple of changes there in terms of the necessity of adjusting the resource prices by deducting the price per set of tires. That was one of the changes that was introduced. The other change regarding repairs and maintenance costs were the attempts at using a more extended average of CPI and PPI where applicable. In other words, for vehicle maintenance, introducing vehicle spares and vehicle maintenance CPI in the calculation of the update for repairs and maintenance. For vehicle operating cost models, a review of the state of rural or free or uninterrupted flow speeds and urban, that is interrupted or flow speed models, was undertaken. The updated values for vehicle operating cost in terms of dollars per kilometer and fuel consumption in liters per kilometer are provided across all the vehicle types. Appropriate models specified for rural and urban traffic flow conditions and road conditions were provided together with the coefficients. In terms of updating the vehicle operating cost model component of the project, we recognized that a substantial amount of work on VOC models has been completed in Australia over time, and it was recognized that some synthesis and consolidation of previous work was required this time round in order to give people a good idea of the base and the departure point of the work. The focus of this component of the project was the re-estimation of vehicle operating cost models for the extended vehicle classification, in other words, the 20 vehicle types, and both urban, in other words, interrupted flow, and rural, uninterrupted flow conditions. It was also acknowledged that the model should reflect only vehicle operating costs, in other words, fuel, oil, tires, repairs and maintenance, and depreciation, with travel time excluded. This was done to prevent confusion that has arisen in the past when travel time was alternately included and excluded over time during these updates. For rural models, for both vehicle operating costs and fuel consumption, these have been estimated for both NIMPAC and HDM speed appropriate to different road and traffic conditions. This slide shows the form of the rural model specified for the project. Coefficients for the rural model were estimated taking into account the following variables: the rise and fall in curvature or alignment of the road, road roughness, road widths, and various vehicle types, weights, and payloads. Coefficients were then derived for both vehicle operating cost and fuel consumption using these inputs. Values were also provided for vehicle operating cost and fuel consumption for both NIMPAC and HDM model speeds, and these are presented in the report. The speeds used are defined speeds on the link, concerned with average time as per a speed flow curve and including stop time where appropriate. This slide provides an overview of the estimation process. This involved the use of a set of HDM submodels updated to the latest unit prices or reflecting the data that we'd updated in terms of fuel, oil, tire prices, etc., and calibrated to Australian conditions to generate a data set of vehicle operating costs across a range of conditions. In other words, incorporating the differences in the variables identified, such as road roughness. This provided a data set used to run regressions and generate a set of coefficients for both vehicle operating costs and fuel consumption models using the specification that you've just seen, and which could then be used to generate tables of values in dollars per kilometer or coefficients for the model which could be adapted by the practitioner. This approach was also used in the case of urban or stop-start models, again reflecting urban traffic conditions. The urban or stop-start uninterrupted flow model followed the two functional forms with a stop-start component for speeds below 60 kilometers an hour and a free flow component for speeds above 60 kilometers per hour. Coefficients were held to vary accordingly. Coefficients and values were therefore derived for both vehicle operating cost and fuel consumption. The coefficients were re-estimated with appropriate adjustments for urban traffic conditions. A single set of operating conditions in terms of road geometry, road width and gross vehicle mass were considered and applied to all 20 vehicle types with appropriate variations in traffic speed. One of the key issues and implications arising out of the work was the importance of the choice of a representative vehicle for an analysis. Vehicle operating cost characteristics vary substantially across vehicle types. This was an important issue when comparing vehicle categories in previous work with the extended 20 vehicle classification used and developed for the NGTSM parameter values. Similarly, characteristics of vehicles at different road and traffic conditions, for example, the stop-start model versus the free-flow model, are especially important as speeds change. An important point with regard to updating values over time is that indexing coefficients in models over an extended period of time, from 2002 to 2013, for example, is the second best to undertaking a periodic and comprehensive review and updating of VOC models. The current slide shows the importance of the choice of a representative vehicle type for an analysis, where a limited number of vehicle classes is used or several vehicle types are aggregated or put together. With differences in vehicle operating cost for two heavy vehicle types, for example, you can see there the operating cost for a B-double and a 5-axle articulated vehicle being quite different under different conditions. This would be an important issue when comparing vehicle categories in Ostrode's previous work with the extended 20 vehicle classification used in the NGTSM. The question is, what exactly is the representative vehicle for a particular set of conditions? The slide also shows the importance of being aware of characteristics of the stop-start model versus the free-flow model, depicted here for articulated trucks and B-doubles. You'll notice the models between the vehicle types track one another for stop-start conditions as speeds increase to 60 kilometers an hour. However, as speeds in each case increase beyond 60 kilometers per hour, the models shift to a free-flow model and the vehicles shift to a lower curve. It must be noted that the speeds used are link-based and therefore derived from travel times applicable to those links. This makes it all the more important to separate time costs from the vehicle operating costs.
Thank you very much for that first section of the presentation, Cliff. And we're going to take some questions now. So while I do read out the ones we've already received, if anyone has any more, please feel free to type them through now. And Cliff and his colleagues will be able to address them shortly. Cliff, we have a question here. This one's come through from Barry, and Barry's joining us from Jacobs Consultancy in Sydney. He's asking, how will the updated parameter values be integrated with the state-based guidelines? So, for example, the TF New South Wales guidelines in New South Wales.
That is really a decision which each of the jurisdictions would have to take. And I notice in the latest appraisal guidelines published by Transport for New South Wales that they do, in fact, obviously acknowledge the existence of the parameter values that have been developed by the NGTSM, and they will make appropriate changes as they see fit. And that is what we would expect for them to do with these sorts of values as they are published. Ed, do you want to contribute anything to answer that particular query at all?
The notion of the national guidelines is to harmonise and have a single set of input variables. It will take, as Cliff said, take some time for this to occur as each of the jurisdictions goes through the process of updating and changing their parameter values. But they will all fall in line eventually.
Great. And how about our friends over in New Zealand? They might be curious to know if and how it might apply to them. Any comment on that?
I think with regard to New Zealand, I mean, these are all values that have been developed for the national guidelines. And in fact, in the case of New Zealand, they have a very well-developed set of values published by the New Zealand Transport Authority in the form of their economic evaluation manual, which contains not only updated prices and guidance on methodologies, but also a very detailed set of vehicle operating cost models, as we've also developed, which are published in terms of both coefficients for different conditions, as well as a set of values which practitioners can take for different travel speeds, for example, and applicable to different road types. So in terms of that piece of work, they're actually in my view, well taken care of.
Thank you very much for that, gentlemen. And I've received a comment here from Baojin, and Baojin is from the TF New South Wales, actually. And they've mentioned that they will adopt the new methodology in 2015 value update. So thank you very much for that comment, Baojin. I'm also going to take this opportunity to remind everyone that we are recording today's session, and so there is no need to frantically take notes. All of today's presentation material, as well as the recording, will be sent to all of our listeners once the session has concluded. So thank you for that. And Cliff, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Angela. The next component we'll move on to talk about is the methodology applied to crash costs. In terms of updating the crash cost values, this was based on 2010 crash data across jurisdictions per crash severity. In terms of urban and rural, that was also applied to freeway conditions for urban freeways, whereas rural conditions reflect crash data which was obtained for rural roads. Now this provided a set of injuries per crash type, or reflecting the crash severities, and against that we had developed a set of injury costs which were used to estimate the average cost of a crash for particular road types, in other words urban freeway and rural roads, using both the human capital and willingness to pay approaches. The Austroads willingness to pay scoping study was the basis of the injury costs that were applied to the crash data for the willingness to pay, and obviously in the case of New South Wales they've also developed a set of, or an updated set of values which are reflected in the Transport for New South Wales appraisal guidelines. And for the willingness to pay costs that we've estimated, we've also included emergency services, legal administration costs and cleanup costs and so on, which were added to the willingness to pay estimates and then applied to the crash severity data. In terms of the human capital values that were generated by the project, I just want to refer to a couple of things, and that is mainly that because of the methodology involved, you can see there that the values of crash costs are pretty similar across jurisdictions, but you'll obviously notice that the rural crash costs are higher than urban in the urban environment due to higher crash rates and crash severities. That's also the case with the values that were generated using the willingness to pay, where you can see that obviously in the rural environment, crash severities dictate that even though you're using the same basis of values for your injury costs, once you start getting a higher crash rate and higher crash severity, you will get a higher average cost of a crash in those different environments, reflecting those road conditions. The other point to note in the report is the potential cost of permanent disability, which is not reflected in the serious injury costs, but is an item that could be researched further. In terms of travel time costs and updating those for the parameter values, this was really done for passenger transport or passenger cars and light vehicles, and was based on the average weekly earnings of full-time equivalent employed people, and as obtained from the ABS. And then, of course, with an assumed private trips, which were valued at 40% of the average weekly earnings, which follows a standard approach, really, which has been applied to Australia over time, and is also in line with what is current practice in the UK. In terms of business trips, these were assumed to be 129.8%, in other words, 135% of the average weekly earnings, less the weighted average payroll tax, of which were then applied to the average weekly earnings. Vehicle occupancy is also important, as you'll see in the report, and that varies across vehicle types. And to take account of this, in terms of the methodology, this is not out of alignment with the UK cost-saving approach for work travel time. In terms of the travel time for freight, this is comprised of two components: that for vehicle occupants, as well as a value of freight, a travel time rather, for freight, which was updated in terms of the PPI for road freight. In terms of freight vehicle occupants, earnings were per heavy vehicle type, as per the Transport Workers Award, and then, of course, taking into account various other cost items and makeup of packages which occur across the different categories of drivers that are held to be driving those particular vehicle types. We recognized there was also a need to update and extend the value of travel time for freight in terms of the geography, in other words, the scope of the or differences across Australia which might arise with regard to transport worker earnings, to different operators and also to other stakeholders. In other words, the likes of warehousing and logistics operators, as opposed to just focusing on transport operators as such. That's just to give you a rundown of what the data looked like for value of travel time for freight across the vehicle types, the different vehicle types. You can see there we've estimated that across as many vehicle types as we could, and then, of course, taking into account differences that would occur as far as urban and non-urban. In other words, intercapital freight as opposed to strictly metropolitan or urban freight. I just want to bring to your attention some developments in travel time methodologies that have occurred, or what is the current state of play between the last update undertaken for the Austroads Guide to Project Evaluation and this particular update. A quick survey of where the research is at revealed that in terms of small travel time savings, not much has changed over time. And there was, in fact, limited appetite really for valuing small travel times savings any differently to what has been done in the past. In terms of travel time reliability and variability, there is a potential application here, but obviously there are challenges in valuing and implementation of these, and some research work would be aimed in this direction in Australia in future. However, we did notice that in terms of reliability ratios, these have been estimated for a handful of countries and may be of some use for Australian purposes, just to calibrate and see what other countries have actually done in this regard. In terms of estimating the value of travel time savings in the UK, we noticed that particular issues are those of trip purpose, in other words, being able to distinguish more closely between business and private travel time, as well as different modes, in other words, car versus public transport, as well as the introduction or how to deal with the value of travel time spent on high-speed rail, given that these days people can actually work on those sorts of modes of transport as opposed to being completely unproductive, as it were. There's also the issue of whether this needs to be employer versus employee valuation in terms of business travel time. And that could be one component that could be of some interest going forward in terms of research. I'd like to spend a bit of time on some reflections and recommendations for the work and some of the possible areas of research flowing from this. I think one of the most important things has obviously been the extension of the vehicle classifications to the 20 vehicle types that we've outlined, and that has important implications for both the costs involved as well as the actual physical or the characteristics of those vehicles, and we need to understand those better as we go forward in future. An assessment of the effects of the re-estimated coefficients on the results of economic evaluations is also required to properly understand their effects across the range of heavy vehicle types, particularly depending on traffic composition. This also involves careful consideration of what constitutes a representative vehicle, especially in the case of where some categories have been or vehicle types have been aggregated. The ease of updating of basic parameter values is also an area which we think would benefit from some consideration in the future in terms of making the updates of basic values, in other words, fuel, oil, tire prices, more regular, in other words, possibly on an annual basis, given that those methodologies have recently been updated, and of course we have a reasonable sample of those sorts of respondents, which could be used relatively easily to generate a new set of very basic parameter values. The impact of the willingness to pay approach in the estimation of crash costs and the inclusion of permanent disability, in other words, some of the issues that I've referred to earlier, especially as far as permanent disability is concerned, we need to understand what some of those costs are. We've referred to some earlier work in the report, which has been very useful, but it still underlines the need to undertake some research in that particular area. That would also affect the estimation of or the willingness to pay of crash costs if a willingness to pay survey is actually done across a number of jurisdictions in Australia. And how one addresses that particular issue in that questionnaire would be very important. The take-up, and we've had a question on that in terms of how the jurisdictions integrate what we've done into their normal work. And in terms of incorporating the revised vehicle operating cost models into jurisdiction traffic models and economic evaluation tools is an area which would be very important going forward. And there would be ample room for discussion, possibly on the National Guidelines website in that regard. The updating and re-estimation of vehicle operating cost models to reflect changes in engine technologies, in other words, international emission specifications that need to be brought in, for example, Euro 4 and their influence on Australian design rules over time. Most of the current vehicle operating cost models are based on fairly dated engine technologies, albeit with adjustments along the way, but this is quite clearly a second best. And so going forward, what we'd recommend is that for the vehicle operating cost models, the changing vehicle technologies over time and even going forward need to be given more attention. The development of a vehicle operating cost calculator or tool which would reflect a range of road and traffic conditions could be made available to practitioners, and some development of that might be worth considering. The linkage of vehicle operating costs with equivalent standard axles for policy analysis is very valuable, because this also provides a direct linkage with operating costs experienced by operators and the impact on the road network and ultimately the policy on road user charging going forward. This could be useful for case studies of major issues such as the marginal cost of road wear and estimating the productivity savings of road investment. Finally, in terms of knowledge management, awareness is required of the research into development of vehicle operating costs over time that has actually been undertaken in Australia to minimize reinventing the wheel. And a lot of work has been undertaken in the past, but that also needs to be documented into an appropriate synthesis of research, of which the work that we've done could form the first part. What we've done is very much a summary of what has been done over time in Australia in this area, and we believe that it merits further detailed consideration to give practitioners a very good platform from which to work in future. This has also been underlined by the confusion over time in terms of what vehicle operating costs actually include. So in other words, the whole issue around including or excluding travel time, and we need to be more cognizant of that and what the methodologies are. So we'd advocate for that as well as being an area meriting further attention. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm going to just refer you very briefly to the NGTSM guidelines website and the report itself, which can be linked there, as well as any further information that might be of use from us and the team. Once again, there's been a number of people that have been involved in this particular project and would be worth talking to in detail for particular aspects which people might need further information on. Before I hand over to Angela for questions, I'd just like to ask my co-presenters whether they have any particular issues or comments that they'd like to make before we take questions. Tyrone, Torolf, Ed? Okay. All right, we'll hand over for questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Cliff. That was indeed very insightful. And ladies and gentlemen, when we send out the presentation material, you'll be able to download that document via the link nice and easily. We've had a few questions now and not a lot of time to answer them in. We've got a nice big audience today, so please do forgive us if we run out of time. Cliff's details are on the screen. If you change the slide there, Cliff, and he will warmly welcome you to contact him if you have any burning questions you'd like to discuss that we can't address today. So a question here that came through from Mark earlier on in the presentation, and I'll read that out for you. Thank you, Mark. He's wondering whether you have a process where you sense check the VOC estimates with industry, although he says it does appear to make abundant sense.
I think we have attempted to do that as far as possible, but I think it's also very useful to calibrate across to the industry. In terms of the work that we did, we actually did look at other sources of data, such as freight metrics, which is quite a comprehensive set of freight vehicle costs, and just to get a sense over different vehicle types, just how far apart we were and what sort of values were being used there, what the characteristics of the vehicles were, and so on, and what numbers were being generated there. The value of that is, of course, because the likes of freight metrics is actually used by the industry, we believe, for tariff or vehicle tariff setting, really, when people want to transport goods from one area to another. So that was as far as that goes. The likes of the various industry peak bodies, I think, are worthwhile as well. And also just looking at, and especially when you're starting to look at changing vehicle technologies and so on, you want to get a better idea of exactly what sorts of vehicles are in fact being operated by transport companies, and to get a better idea of those costs. And to get a more extended survey, I would recommend in the future that more consultation or more input from the industry in a manageable way is undertaken. Any other comments from the team?
Anybody else have anything to add to that? We're all good? Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark, for your question there. I hope we've managed to clarify that for you a little bit better. Another question here from Natalie. So Natalie's asking, would it be fair to say that the inclusive WTP values, including the added emergency services, replace the WTP values previously estimated by Austroads?
Yes, they would replace them. In the case of Transport for New South Wales, they continually do their own updates, so of course they run with their own set of values as well, reflecting different crash severities and so on that are applicable to their jurisdiction. But in short, the answer is yes, those values would replace the current values that have been published. And in fact, what we've done with this particular update was draw on the previous work that has been done in terms of willingness to pay costs per injury type and so on, and then of course use that as the basis for our calculation, and of course looking across to the crash severity data that was generated for 2010, which is an Austroads database, and using that in the calculation. So in short, yes, that would be the methodology used and the recommendation.
Great. Thank you kindly, Natalie, for your question. Another question here from Barry. So Barry's referring to crash costs, and he's asking, well, he'd like to ask the panel which costs they feel should be used, accident costs or WTP. He feels that practitioners are slightly confused as to which one.
I think, I suspect what Barry's referring to is whether to use the human capital approach versus the willingness to pay. In short, and I think the standpoint from various jurisdictions is that you would be best using both. So in other words, obviously the human capital approach, which has been used up till now, and of course because of course different jurisdictions have various views on the application of the willingness to pay estimates because of the difference in costs and so on. The recommendation, I think the standpoint for example, in a number of jurisdictions is that that both are used. The only other issue that I'd add is whether the willingness to pay numbers, for example, include additional costs, and that's why in the report what we've done is publish a set of values for the straight willingness to pay, as well as a set of additional costs, in other words, to reflect emergency services, cleanup costs, and so on. Ed, would you like to contribute something?
Yeah, I will put a contribution here. The Austroads board in late 2010 made a policy decision that in relation to the Austroads guide to project evaluation, that jurisdictions should move towards adopting the willingness to pay approach, but continue to express costs using the human capital approach for a comparative purpose for some time.
All right, well, thank you for those comments, and thank you, Barry, for your question. We have another one here from Cameron. Thank you, Cameron. He's asking, what is recommended for estimating VOCs for future years? He's saying, I'm thinking here particularly about fuel costs and fuel consumption. Any thoughts on that?
I think we provided some guidance in one of the last sections of the report as to what sorts of indices could be used to update different elements between this update, as it were, and in the future. Obviously, in the case of fuel, for example, quite detailed fuel data, in other words, price data, is readily available from Fuel Track. So that would be my first port of call, really, if I wanted to update fuel prices and get the best available at the moment for a particular local government area or study area which you happen to be using for your evaluation. For vehicle operating cost models, that's a longer term exercise, I think. Tyrone, do you want to add anything on that score in terms of updating the VOC models as such?
We'll pass that microphone around. Thanks, Tyrone.
Yes, on the vehicle operating cost models, as was explained by Cliff, we've taken a step back and basically rebuilt them based on the thinking of some time ago, but also the extensive work that had been done at the time to validate it against industry. Now, I'd be suggesting in going forward, we, as part of the updating process, the coefficients, etc., re-estimated. We've got the tools, etc., to hand to re-estimate them as we go through the parameter value updating on a more regular basis. But what I think is needed is another major study akin to what was done in the 90s because of the movement with the technology, etc., in the industry. So I'd be suggesting that as a major re-benchmarking, as well as simply more regular updates, much as Cliff explained on the parameter values.
Thank you very much for your thoughts on that one, Tyrone. We have actually gone slightly over the 45-minute allocated time frame for this webinar, but just before we do close down, Cliff, are there any final words you'd like to leave with our audience today? Any key messages that you'd like them to take from your presentation today?
Only that if they wish to discuss any of these issues that we've raised, whether it's the prices themselves, how to apply them, or the methodologies involved, background information and so on, that they contact us, and between myself and other members of the team, we'd like to enter into that sort of discussion with them, really. Ed and Tyrone? Torolf?
We'd welcome your feedback and discussion so we can make sure that we're putting the research program forward which meets your needs.
Right, and I think that's it from our side.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you, Cliff, for your time in putting today's presentation together and for delivering it, along with our other panel of experts here. We have Ed, Tyrone and Torolf here as well, as mentioned earlier. So thank you for your time in joining us today. Please do keep an eye on your emails, as you'll be receiving some correspondence from us. And if there is anything that you'd like to discuss with any of our panel of experts here today, of course, I welcome you to contact them at any stage. Thank you so much, and hope you can join us for future webinars here at URB.